Hey everybody, this is a Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for March 6th, 2025. Um, all right, we have a few agenda items. So let's get started. Tim, I think you are up first.
Hey all, this is it's a topic we've talked about before, and in fact, I put it on the unconference agenda for London. But since we were having a meeting, well, we were having a meeting 2 weeks ago, and I thought I'd put it on the agenda, and then I got bumped. So here we are. The pain is less acute than it was 2 weeks ago, but um, I again wanted to bring up the topic for consideration about how can we find a way to get more information about how people are using our software. In many places we operate blind. We have to take the most conservative of positions on every sort of compatibility impacting topic. And I think we've all felt, some change or another where we're making the wrong decision because we have no other information that says it would be safe to do. Um, and I mean, I appreciate that we have a deep commitment to compatibility, and I think that our customers and users appreciate it too. Um, but I wanted to ask again here, like, this is a room full of smart people. Like, can we not find some way to get more information from our customer bases, either directly or by proxy through the major providers or something? I wish I had a solution to bring, but I don't. So that's the problem statement.
So I think that, and maybe this will be the part of the unconference, so we don't need to talk too much about it here, but I would think that trying to characterize a little more tightly what kind of questions you want to ask, right? Generally, just I want information. Like, if we could be like, is this API used? Is this feature used? Are there certain metrics that we could say, hey, can we export these metrics? There's an opt-in. Like, what would those metrics be? Like feature gate metrics, right? Things like that could be super useful. We have a thing in PRR where we say, how will a cluster operator know that feature is in use by its users? And we try and make people put metrics in for that beyond even just the feature gates. Like those kind of metrics could probably be really useful. And if we had a mechanism like that, then we could even be like, hey, let's we need telemetry, and we have this feature. It's been there for 4 years. We don't know if anybody uses it. We don't have any telemetry for it. We'll add it in a release, and then in another couple of years, we'll know, you know, whether we can remove it.
Yeah, I mean, clearly we're not, like, at one end of a spectrum is we dump the entire state of etcd into a store with some anonymization to it and we process it. I don't think we're suggesting that. Um, at the other end of the spectrum, we say we effectively have an empty message that people's clusters send, and then over time we decide which very select pieces of information we want to put in there, right? Like number of nodes, or maybe even that is too sensitive. But we got to figure out which gates are turned on, or and if you wanted to add a new piece of information, you got a question that you want answered, there's a process by which you get the question reviewed and refined, and the mechanism for extracting that information reviewed and refined, and then it would roll out. So if I wanted to know how many users out there are actually using the Git repo volume plugin, right, I could in theory have gone to some group like this and said, here's the query that I want to put into the telemetry system, and here's the data I expect to get back, and here's why it's anonymous enough. And we would have approved it, and it would have rolled out over some period of time. And obviously we don't have that. And I'm forced with my provider hat on to say, like, would I even encourage my customers, as GKE customers, to turn that on, right? What do we do? We're never going to get 100%, right? Can we really make decisions based on less than that data? I mean, I guess the optimist in me hopes that we could get some sort of representative sample. And if the representative sample came back and said about 1% of users are using the Git repo volume, then I would know, maybe it's not one, maybe it's three, but it's not 50. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here. There's a bunch in the chat. Why don't people talk?
David was next, I think.
So it sounds like there's maybe three aspects at least, just to get started, right? Like one aspect is adding to the code the your empty submit nothing. That's we can probably agree there's no identifying information in that. That seems like a thing that maybe we could do.
Well, there,
Source
there
IP.
is there is if it submits it to a central place, we know where it's being submitted from. We know how many. Like actually, a lot of information just in that it gets submitted. We that has to be
That's
opt
right.
in.
That's
Sure,
right.
but I'm going to assume that if the CNCF has a thing here, they have a recommended library. Hopefully they do. I guess if they don't, that would be sad, and you might ask why you even have the option. But okay, let's assume there's a recommended library. We use the thing. The second aspect is who is going to even turn that on. Um, so uh, you there are certainly corporate questions. Knowing whether GKE would turn it on might be useful. I don't actually know. I have significant doubts that Red Hat would turn it. Certainly wouldn't turn it on by default. Like, would we encourage people to turn it on? Would we stop people from turning it on? Don't I don't know. And then the third thing is like where and how do you get the information? Is all the information from it public? Is it something like members only?
Yep.
Who holds the keys of access? Who
Yep.
runs the infrastructure that actually receives this and pays the bill to receive the data? Um, those seem like important questions to know. And then I guess the fourth thing is even after that, how would you convince yourself that your sample is representative? Right? Like I deal with a lot of on-prem clusters. A significant portion of those clusters do not have any direct internet access at all. So even if they wanted to, and they don't, they could not send back their telemetry, which does make it a guessing game. And I'm not sure what you would do there.
Yep. This is part of the problem. Like I know there are air gap clusters. I know there are clusters that run in the back of select vehicles that are never going to connect to the internet, and I will never get that information. Um, so, I mean, that is truth. Do we admit defeat and just continue flagellating ourselves with the lack of information, or again, we have a room full of smart people. I challenge us to find other ways to approach this. Maybe we have, I don't know, maybe there's indirections, or maybe there's providers that collect and anonymize. Like, would it be more amenable if customers sent telemetry for OpenShift clusters to Red Hat, and Red Hat did its own magical thing and presented a representative sample of that data anonymized to Red Hat's concerns? I'm thinking out loud here. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I think I was next. Gathering the questions and figuring out the mechanism where those questions can be answered for a particular cluster. I mean, we have metrics stuff, like figuring out a way to report the questions as metrics seems very possible, right? So like, I don't think it would be controversial to take some of the questions you're talking about, like how many Git repo uses do you have, or how many times did this code path that we think no one is calling but maybe someone crazy is, like how many times does it get hit, like those types of things, like wiring those to metrics seems very easy and straightforward and non-controversial to do. The question then is, how do those metrics in various places, in various clusters, in various environments, through various providers, whatever, make it up to a place where we, the project, can make decisions about it? And I kind of see three modes. Like, there's they don't, and by default, I think that should stay the default. So by default, the metrics are there. If you want to look at them on your cluster, you can, but by default, they don't go anywhere. The second option maybe is a way to opt a particular cluster into reporting it somewhere. Maybe. Lots of questions about like how that would work, but maybe you could opt in a cluster to report it somewhere. And then the third option, I think, is the manager of that cluster has a well-defined way to pull that information, and then they can apply their own aggregation, or whatever they want to do, and then they can take it, bring it to the project. So providers of thousands of clusters could aggregate that information and then report like percentages or whatever is acceptable up. And so if you aren't paying attention to this and you don't do anything, by default your clusters don't phone anywhere and like nothing happens. The metrics are there if you are interested. If you want your clusters to provide this usage, we should be super clear about what this is. They can do that. You can opt into that. Or if you want to, if you're managers of these clusters and you want to aggregate and you don't want to disclose network locations or total counts or whatever, you want to aggregate it, there should be a well-defined path for that as well. And so people who want their usage to be considered by the project have a couple ways to do it: direct reporting or aggregated reporting. That's kind of my mental model.
Go ahead next.
Yeah, I think it's Ben, then Dan, then Dims.
So, a couple things. We have some PII currently. We've talked to the Linux Foundation about that, but all the information we have right now is you decided to pull an image from us. You decided to fetch a binary from us. So you opted in implicitly to providing us like your IP address by pinging our server. And we don't do a lot with that, but we do have like logs and things, and we have done some analysis on that. That has a separate policy though. That's just the privacy policy. CNCF is pretty clear. If we do want to go forward this, in addition to the project figuring out, we will have to reach out to the Linux Foundation and discuss with them. Their default state is projects don't collect telemetry. If you want to collect telemetry, talk to us about it, get it cleared with legal. So that's something to keep in mind is even if we get to a place where we agree to it, then before we can enact it, the next step is we have to reach out. We can coordinate that through steering if we get to that point. I think the question of representative sample, I mean that's not a totally solvable problem, but I think collecting a sample gives us more information, and if users are not going to respond or tell us, you know, having more data points about is this feature removable. If you've totally opted out of telemetry, you don't have any contact with the project, and then we remove something you're using. I mean, how are we supposed to know? At some point, I think it's reasonable to say if you completely don't participate in any way, I think we just can't make decisions exclusively from the data. We need to have some other ways to make sure that I don't know, maybe we put something on Kubernetes announce and we say, hey, we're looking at removing a feature. Do you use this feature? Something like that. So that people that are paying attention but aren't giving telemetry have some input.
And we have like soft removal, like it's in the release notes. We disable a thing by default. So if you were using it, you'll notice when you try to upgrade, but there's a way to like get it back by turning on a gate and come talk to, like we have sort of soft removal strategies that we've used.
Yeah. I think Kate's Infra could host something like this if we go that route. And you could also probably imagine like the kind of aggregator being run by some providers if they're
We did
interested.
run it. We did
But
run it for a while. We had it. We had
yeah,
a little service that was, you could run in your cluster, and it would provide just a really little bit of information just to show that we could do it. And we dumped it all into BigQuery, and it was, not very useful because we didn't have a whole lot of information in there. And then just everybody was busy, and nobody had the
I'm
follow-up.
not signing anyone up to implement it, but I think we could like kind of review and provide machines or whatever. I think that's a
long
reasonable
before we
thing
get
to.
long
But
before we get
that
to
was a
that
question that was
conversation.
raised earlier. I think that that's a reasonable thing for the project to use its resources for if we decide we want to do this.
Sure, but
And
even
I'll
the
let Dan go now.
CNCF conversation is premature. Like, I'm not going to go talk to somebody at CNCF about it until I know how we as a community would be satisfied when, to look our customers in the face and say, this is what we're doing and this is why. And this is what happens if you don't participate. And I don't think we're there yet.
Their policy actually states that the project needs to agree first, but then before you implement, you need to actually, then that's the next step.
Well,
I think Dan
I
was
think
next.
that I'm not sure the Linux Foundation plays in if if the path we take is aggregation through providers, so the agreements between the provider and the provider's customer. But anyway, that's beside the point. I think who's next? Dan?
Okay.
So Tim, you mentioned something about anonymizing data. I think once we get to the point where we have to anonymize things, we've already lost. Nobody's going to opt in at that point because they have no contract with us. We have no legal obligation to, not do horrible things with their data, and so they're just not going to give it to us. Other side, OpenShift collects a ton of telemetry data, and yet it always seems to me that every time we have a question, it's always something like, how many customers are using this particular aspect of this particular feature, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out that our telemetry doesn't have enough information for us to answer that question. So maybe it would be neat, instead of having like constantly gathering all this data, if we could just get people to run a opt-in telemetry operator that would ping some server, central server every now and then and find out, hey, Kubernetes wants to know how many Git repo volumes you have. I will be sending the following data. This cluster has 10 nodes and 500 pods and 0 volumes using Git repo. Is this okay? And it could all be like based on cell expressions or something, maybe to limit its power.
Dan, do you anticipate any of our customers saying yes? Like,
No?
what if in the other direction we went and said, like, we already have a metric. We want to know the answer to it. Google, Red Hat, will you share how many, or share what percentage? Because we all know that we're never going to share how many. Which percentage of your clusters have this on? Like, that would be concrete.
I think the problem with only doing that though is that it excludes anybody that's not under like one of the big vendors.
But it'd be a starting point, right? Like, can we agree that like if we don't get the big vendors to do it, then the number of non-big vendor clusters is small enough that most of us would not be convinced that it was representative of our customers?
But also, like, I know that our telemetry data could not answer the question, how many people are using Git volumes or Git repo volumes?
Yeah, so like turning it around and phrasing it as specific queries, which people could approve, is an interesting idea. I do think, a lot of people would just ignore that and just turn that email off entirely. If it was a OpenShift would like to know, so we can work on our product, this information for you, and we are going to report it back to the Kubernetes project, and this is our anonymization policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe, because they do have a relationship with you, and they probably have stronger trust with you than they do with me. So, maybe something like that could work. And even, I don't even care about really percentages. I care about like bucketed percentages. Like less than 1%, trivial, right? 1 to 10%, present, 10% to 20% moderate, et cetera. And you just tell me like, what percentage of users are using this feature? And you can go back and say
users, workloads, clusters.
Yeah, again, like refining the question is a whole other category. Sorry, Dim's his hand up for a long time.
Oh, that's okay. I don't. There's a lot of interesting questions being raised here, and fewer answers than we would like. So how do we like? My one thing that I was thinking about was like, how do we categorize? uh, Like, how do we know this is a cluster from where we can get some meaningful information? We don't want all the millions of kind clusters and K3s clusters, which are running in CI/CD jobs and things like that, right? Like they're going to skew any metrics we get and any answers that we would like, right? Like, so
if I could just pause for 1 second, if they're running in a CI/CD pipeline and they're using a Git repo in some test or some function of that, we do want to know. So, I mean, it just even refines your point more and hammers your point home more, I think. But anyway, go on.
I mean, simple example is like people still have really old clusters, right? And like we haven't been able to force them to turn them down. So that is the kind of thing that I was thinking about. It might still be using it, but I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking wrong. But it's just the massive number of like things like kind and K3s, and it could be even the Kubernetes that is built into Docker Hub and things like that, right? So yeah, that's basically what I was thinking about. at this point.
Yeah,
do
I would
fingerprint.
echo John's point though that like if you're breaking things that people are using in those CI/CD pipelines, like we actually probably do want to know that.
Right. The existence of the Git repo plugin versus the use of Git repo plugin is basically what it comes down to, right, Ben?
Right, but I would assume that, this metric would be, oh, you've actually deployed a pod that uses it. And whether or not that pod is in your prod cluster or your CI cluster before prod doesn't matter that much. It still indicates that you're using a manifest that depends on this feature as part of your workflow. And we probably want to know that.
Right.
So
So basically we can't
keep this just
we,
one more
we
minute, guys, because we have other topics. Yep.
just wrapping it up, like we can't look for existence of feature gates, but the use of the feature itself, right? So we would have to differentiate that better. So that's basically what I was driving at.
Yes, agreed. And we try to do that a little bit in the PRR questions, but we're not always successful. Like sometimes the answer is like, look for this type of device, and maybe cube state metrics will get it, but maybe it won't aggregate enough. Like it's all the same things Dan brought up.
Right, right.
Okay, thank you. That's a good topic, and we have a whole bunch of time at the conference for those of you who will be there, and hopefully others will be there to contribute as well. The unconference. Next topic is excuse me, Vinayak.
Hey, so talking of Git repo some more, I guess. But yeah, we're planning to disable it by default. And one of the graduation criteria he said was like we have like a long living place where we can give validating admission policies uh, to people using it. Otherwise, we shouldn't do it because like we don't have a good stable place to put those policies. So everything else is like ready, but like the Git repo part for this, like where we want to set up a repo where we can put we can put. I guess the idea was to put all kinds of policies, not just validating, but like even if we suggest some mutating policies in the future. And I think an email was sent out about this, and generally there are people agreed, but some people were against it. But I opened the issue anyways to see if people would be okay with having a place where we could suggest like policies for things that we can't immediately fix, but would have opinions about, or things we can't fix because of architectural issues, and would have opinions about. And like we haven't really given a very crisp description of what this repo will entail, but like that's the general idea. And if we are not comfortable doing it, then I'm totally okay with like closing those PRs out and trying again. I don't want to rush anybody into a decision, but I just need to know so that I can plan.
Well, I guess who's objecting right now? Because Dims and I both plus one it, and I think a few other folks plus one it. Was there anybody?
There was some back and forth in the email thread.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Tim, Ben.
Yeah. In general, the question that you get, Vinayak, is like, how are you going to prevent bit rot, right? That I think that was one of the questions that came up in the email thread, if I remember right. So if you can convince people that yes, there'll be a set of people who will own this and curate this and make sure it is still valid and clean things up when it needs to be cleaned up and not let it be there forever. That sort of thing, right? So if you can answer that question a little bit, I think you'll be fine. And like I'm happy to just let this go and say, a year from now we're just going to shut it down if it just bit rots.
I mean, I can sign up to maintain it for sure, but like where should we have that discussion? Is the real question. Should we have it
The
here
issue
or
is
like
fine. In the issue is
in the
fine.
issue? Okay.
Like, yeah,
Yeah.
just identify the list of people who are willing to help with this repository, and so we can add them as owners. Yeah.
David.
It's probably going to be really important. I saw Tim commented on this as well, to think about rules for what goes in and what doesn't go in. Right? Could I add an admission policy here that I think is awesome to restrict something that Argo creates. Might be like a basic thought experiment.
Right, the owners will end up drafting those rules, David. That's the way I was thinking about it.
Yeah, it's important to approve this before we know what will go into it.
Yeah, that's chicken and egg, right? So I would rather give them space to do their work, and then we can like influence their work through discussions.
We have like a general direction hashed out in the issue. I think people might want to like, draft a document that goes in the repo or something and iterate a little bit over time to clarify it. But I don't think anybody who's been discussing this is looking for a super general purpose one. This is aimed, very roughly speaking, at core Kubernetes types, core Kubernetes functionality using core Kubernetes admission policy types to do policies that are sort of fixes for the core. So like Git repo, you should be able to have a policy to like soft remove it ahead of the actual removal. Because we can't roll that out for everyone by default, and we don't want to do an admission controller, but we could just write a policy for that. I
Even
think
the
we
guideline,
can.
like this is a backfill for an accepted rep that's making a change in a newer minor. Like even something like that is a much clearer sort of mission statement.
So what
Yeah.
I suggest then is maybe just in the issue there, just document, okay, here are the people who are going to be maintaining this. This is the scope, like what Ben and Jordan just said. And then we'll create the repo, and then you'll have a README in there that defines those policies and the owners file that defines the owners. And, if we need tests or something that, run against the latest releases, I mean, I don't think we should, because those admission policies should be backward compatible, but like whatever we need, we put in the policy in the README and sort of define it there. That would be my suggestion. David?
One other thing for the README when you're considering scope, it's easy to define validating admission policy that requires the existence of other CRDs to be defined, and instances of those CRs, in fact. And choosing whether or not you plan to do that is probably also another significant choice for the overall shape of the repo. I've got no objection to the idea. I don't even have an objection to the idea of like, yeah, we're gonna allow all those things. But I think it's important that you sit down and think about what that scope actually is, because it will not take very long for those questions to come up.
Yeah, I agree. I think the first thing we have to do is iterate more on the scope so it doesn't become a dumping ground, or like people that want to add policies for like third-party policy controllers or something like that. We probably don't want to be hosting all of that, but it would be useful to have a place where we can share things like, hey, we're going to remove this functionality. You can install this to preemptively prepare for it, especially because it's a security issue.
Yeah, no issue.
Okay. Any other questions there, or shall we move on?
I think that's great. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, last item is one mine. Hopefully some people have read this document, but I can give the overview of the idea. So effectively in DRA, we have this concept of a resource slice, which just allows device vendors and others to model their devices in the API server in a consistent built-in API that then the scheduler can understand that API and resolve resource claims, which are requests for resources, using those consistent APIs and semantics of those APIs. In 131-ish, I think it was, we introduced what we call our basic device type in resource slice, which is pretty simple. It's just got basically a list of attributes. It's just basically a name and a bunch of metadata. And so pretty simple semantics. On top of that, the claim can define cell selection on top of those attributes. So that's to give you an example of the type of thing we do. Now, that's not enough to meet all the use cases and model all the different types of devices out there. So over time, we've begun adding new things. And the way we do this modeling in order to comply with our API evolution standards is that we have this basic device one of, this device one of, basic is one of it. And then in a cap in this release, we add something called composite. And then, but the trick here is that we have like 3, 4 caps, right, that are all adding different fields. And the way this safety mechanism for API evolution works with a one of is that the device vendor has to pick one of these different models, as opposed to being able to take advantage of all of these features to model it. Well, the reality is that these are all sort of building on top of one another. So we end up with a basic and a composite and an attachable and a consumable and a combination of all 4. Like we end up basically with a series of one-ofs, each of which is a superset of the other one. And there is zero reason in the world for anybody to ever use anything but the latest one. And so carrying this out all the way through to GA, you end up with what is arguably, in my opinion, at least, a terrible API, which is a bunch of one of structs, each of which is a superset of the other. So we have like 4 or 5 obsolete things basically in the API, and just one real one in the end.
Are we sure we understand like the API service well enough that all the future editions are going to be like supersets? I don't know.
No, but we do have an alternate. So it's a resource slice with devices, and we could actually add gizmos instead and have the one of at that level. So we have like multiple levels of one of. So we have devices, and then we have something below devices. We have basic and composite. So at the devices thing, yeah, you never know, right? You could end up with something, but I think we'd be okay with making a gizmo if it's that different than a device.
So we've already seen like sort of the next crop of
We have
editions.
At least 4 editions,
and all of them are like, oh yeah, just that plus one more thing, and that plus one more thing, and that plus one more thing.
Yes. And we're not, at least I'm not convinced we'll ever need gizmos, right? Like, so, but we have that option there if we need it. So what we're suggesting in this document is that we go to a new V1 Beta 2 API that flattens that one of up or pulls it up into the device. And then the question becomes, okay, how do we deal with the API evolution question? And one is for our built-in components, we just don't advance things quite fast. Most of our things don't touch kubelet, so we don't have this like this long version queue. These are control plane. It's mostly scheduler and third-party drivers. So for the scheduler, basically, we don't advance a cap so fast that that the skew means something so old can't know about the field at all. That's kind of our mitigation there. On the driver side, there's effectively two mitigations. One is drivers need to know about the feature gates, and administratively, like when you're turning on and off feature gates for these new features, we sort of make the drivers. Ideally, the drivers would administratively do that so that they're not relying on a feature gate that's not set in the API server. But we also have a more automated mitigation idea where we would build into our driver framework, our library that people can use, and it's only in Go, but at least it's an example. A special internal device type that nobody would ever request in scheduling that exercises the entire set of fields. In other words, populates them all, writes that to the API server and reads it back. Even in dry run, you can do it, and this works. And we can detect, based on which fields get blanked out, which feature gates are enabled on the API server. So this is like a fallback mechanism for if the administrator screwed up, basically, and enabled a feature gate in the driver that the API server doesn't support. Then we can at least detect that, and the driver can basically say, I refuse to publish these devices. So that's kind of our summary of like why we're doing it, and then what our mitigations are since we're not following the standard practice. And I think there's a bigger discussion that Tim could have brought into the document you'll see of like, this is really a broader problem in how we do API versioning. We are kind of coming up with a tactical solution here, but there's probably a bigger question for how we can do this longer term across the board in the project. Oh, the floor's open then.
Completely acknowledge the problem, have no solution.
I had a
I was
You
comment.
are our
Tim to,
API reviewers.
I was waiting for Tim to like just bring us brilliant solutions as the person most familiar with DRA.
But so I don't think the problem is DRA. Like DRA is just tickling the problem.
Yes.
I don't think the problem is DRA.
Sidecar, for example, right? That's like an early instance of the problem.
This is being discussed in Gateway API group right now as well. Like when you add new fields to the Gateway API and existing implementations don't know what to do with them.
Yes.
It's not even that they don't know what to do with them. They don't know they don't know.
They also
They don't
don't
even
really
see
need
them.
to care.
They don't even
Many
see them.
times you add a field they don't need to care about. Like how many times have we changed HPA because we added something? Like the answer is never, because it cares about scale, right? Or in concept replicas.
Can you restate that point, David? I didn't quite follow your
So
point.
like we're talking about, I guess many of the things here are focusing on all those cases where it doesn't work right to simply ignore the fact that a field exists or a new field was created.
Yes.
Many cases are actually cases where the client actually really doesn't care that there's a new field. They're making decisions based on the fields they know about, just what their contract is, and they're making decisions to change fields that they know about via a patch, for instance, based on their contract, and that doesn't change. So
Right, and that's fine, and that works fine. And so the question is, what do we do in these cases where, like with Sidecar or with some of the DRA stuff, where if you don't see the field, it still looks valid. It's just not right. And so, how do we deal with that situation? I see Tim's hand.
Yeah, just to emphasize, like the Sidecar one is a great example. If I'm a client of Pod, right, like a kubelet, for example, and we added a new field to status, like maybe the kubelet just doesn't care, right? And it doesn't need to know that it doesn't know because it's just not equipped to populate that field, and it doesn't matter. And because all new fields are optional, who cares? But in the Sidecar case, it just does the wrong thing because a thing that was previously valid is now is not even invalid, right? Sorry, it is still valid. It's just missing one extra piece. So, my first thought was, hey, let's make it so that clients can pass unknown field detection all the way back up to the informers and up and up and up. So the client app would say, oh, there's a field I don't understand. I choose to barf, right? At least it can make a decision. But it's not even sufficient. Like, do we now have to self-categorize this new
breaks all
field
those
or
cases David just brought up, right? Where it's fine.
Exactly. Do we have to self-categorize every new PR to say this field is semantically meaningful in these
And now we know how X509 TLS ended up with criticality indicators on extensions. If you don't understand this field, you must reject this object.
Yeah. I mean, API evolution is hard. We've had this problem forever. We've just not given it really much attention.
Yeah, we've skirted around it by having like a single consumer of a thing. Like the kubelet is the consumer of the pod. So as long as the kubelet understands it, like hand wave, it's mostly okay. And then we put bounds on how stale can a kubelet be. Like no more than 3 minors, or like, and even that we don't do a great job on. We're like, here's a new field, we'll let you put it in the spec. If you want to use it, hope your nodes are up to date. Otherwise, it's going to get really squirrely.
I mean, we're essentially doing that here with the scheduler, which has a shorter skew, which thank God. But we're also putting in this on the producer side, right? Some protection so the producer can detect, hey, I'm trying to produce something that API server doesn't understand, and so I won't.
Are we worried about the opposite direction where you have I guess not if it's the producer. And again, I'm not super familiar with all the DRA service, so I apologize. But like, I remember CSI plugins having issues where like we had to figure out like a handshake where they could advertise what features they support, so that the central controllers we could guarantee were more up to date would know if a particular new field in CSI stuff could even be honored. Like, I don't know if we have the same thing.
I don't think we have
had
that
like
issue.
an old build of a DRA driver that didn't even understand a thing. Maybe that.
No, because they're the producer, and if they use the field, they use the field. Otherwise, if they're old, they just don't use the field, and we're all happy.
I mean, knowing who your writers are is helpful. Having a maximum bound on how old or out of date they are is helpful. But those are both just sort of like band-aid problems to the actual.
Yeah, and the time bound for kubelets means that any such feature, if we really want to be safe, needs to sit in alpha for at least a year. Even if there's no risk to it, it just needs to sit in alpha for a year because there's a risk that the kubelet might misinterpret it.
Or you figure out how to make it fail in an ugly way, and you're just like, them's the breaks. If you used it on an old node, it's just going to fail in an ugly way. So we've done that as well, right? Which isn't great, but at least if your nodes are up to date, it doesn't make you artificially wait for another 8 months. So like someone else in the world doesn't get ugly failures.
Yeah, I mean, with Sidecar, you could imagine the kubelet saying, if you had some way to mark this, you could have had old kubelet say, you have a new thing. I don't know what this is. Don't schedule it to me. Something like that.
Renald's hand.
Yeah, I think so. We added something, the node feature in the node status, but the scheduler doesn't use that. So should we consider you starting to use that?
That actually, that's a separate topic. We actually introduced, I can share it in the agenda afterward. It was a discussion on one of the scheduler plugin issues. And I think we're going to introduce that in SIG node and SIG scheduling. Francisco, I think, was going to look at that. I asked him if he'd volunteer. I don't think he said yes or no, but he's interested in it. So
that solves
for
that solves for one particular case of things, right? Like, taken to its extreme, imagine a self-detecting micro version on every struct in the entire system, and you have to look at the version of every struct that you use and decide if it's a version that you know about. And the version is set not based on what the server has, but what you're using in that struct. Like, describing that system out loud, I can't imagine it being a usable thing, but that's kind of what we're talking about. Any field that is properly a one of, that follows the sort of the current best practices, should be detectable, but not everything is a one of, right? The sidecars with the restart policy, like, that field was always there. It was just not something you were allowed to set before, and now it is something you're allowed to set.
So there was one point raised about, making it feel ugly so that, if your nodes are up to date, you don't have to be held up for 8 months. Philosophically, that's sort of why this document exists. Like, we're building towards an API, and there's this short period, relatively speaking, of a year or two, and I don't want to make all of our users suffer for the next 10 years in order to avoid some obscure edge cases in the next year on alpha and beta code, right? So that's kind of, I mean, nobody's arguing we shouldn't be doing what we're doing, but I'm just, so maybe I'm selling past the close here, but that's kind of the motivating principle. It's a similar thing of like, let's try and do what's going to be best for most of our users in the long run. You know, it's the integral of pain over time, as opposed to the spikes or short spikes early on. Well, I guess if there's not that much discussion, I thought there'd be more discussion, but take a look at the document. We can kind of, I think we have a path right now for DRA. The question is, do we need to do more for the future, for other features broader?
I would also point out that if we do nothing about this, like we are implicitly deciding that we don't care about this enough to do something. And I don't believe that is actually true, but because it's a hard decision and we don't have a good answer and nobody is tasked with exploring this to completion, the default answer is we don't care. We're willing to break people this way.
Yeah. CC, you had your hand up, but it went back down. Was there?
Oh, thank you. Am I not understanding this problem clearly? But I just wondering, I saw like a similar practice in other APIs where we specifically indicate the, for example, device type here. Is there any like concern if we kind of ask for a specific device type kind of specified, so we know like which fields we're gonna look at like for which device type? And
yeah, so I think Tim's experience with service was that sort of validation and behavior is extremely brittle and difficult. But I don't know, Tim may have more.
Service is effectively a one of, but it doesn't follow any reasonable practices. So the validation and the evolution of it is just a mess, and it's become just sort of a quagmire trying to add anything to it. A proper one of is fine, but again, like a one of solution wouldn't have helped in the sidecar case because we didn't think ahead to make a one of option, a self-describing option for restart policy. Like taken to its extreme, what is an API object? It's a repeated one of where each instance in the list has exactly one field set. Like we might as well just make our entire API map of string to any. Like I don't think we're really talking about that.
Yeah, and the idea of a type that then causes subsets of fields to get validated is kind of equivalent to that, and just a little harder to manage. So that's kind of why we didn't go that direction. We have optional fields that can be layered one on top of the other, composed, but they're actually orthogonal. Like it's not like a type. That's the thing. A type, a one of works well when it's a type, but there aren't actually types. It's actually a bunch of orthogonal features that could be used for modeling. Depending on what the device supports. Sergey?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on a similar thing. Like, I don't think it relates to this one, but with Sidecar, the problem wasn't only something doesn't understand the new field, but also old API. If you deserialize and serialize using old APIs, it will just strip out some fields or make something unusable. I don't think in this case it's a problem. I don't think old webhooks or anything will break resource size spec in this way. Like, but that is
it's old schedulers that are a problem. Like an old scheduler. So we had a field say that refines the scheduling process, and now and that would maybe, I'm just making this up. This isn't like a specific one, but like. The old scheduler doesn't see the field, so it picks from one of 5 devices, whereas the new scheduler would see the field and know that only one device is actually what you want. So you could end up with scheduling to the wrong device, for example. That's like an example of how an old scheduler could not see the new field and then make a poor choice because of that.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about poor choice right now. I'm talking about some webhooks that installed in a, like mutation webhook installed in the system, and it for some reason deserialized and serialized back, and by doing that, it will lose some properties of field.
Okay,
That's what we saw
got it.
with sidecar. So I
Ooh.
think this is a really important consideration whenever you add new fields or changing something, because it may put your system, like put unintentionally your object in inconsistent state. We actually working on documentation right now on a like Kubernetes website to have best practices how you develop mutating webhooks. And this is one of the item here. Like if you don't know about things, like try to do patches instead of like deserializing, serializing back and stuff like that. But like it's still the case that like I saw frameworks that will just hide from you like the fact that they deserialize and serialize back. So that's a very important consideration here. And I don't think it will break in this case, but we maybe need to review it again.
Yeah, thank you, Sergey. That's a good point. Tim?
I had a thought based on that, and I totally lost it. We have a similar problem with things, controllers that want to assert some state and end up doing like a textual diff, right? They read an object, they diff it against some known state, and if anything has changed, then they do something based on that. And I was looking at some code, actually it was Dan's code just yesterday, that does exactly this, trying to avoid doing an API write, where probably the correct thing to do would just be to craft a patch which sets exactly the fields that you intend to set and just write it, and don't try to do the diff. Like, how many times have we been bitten by hot loops from some controller that read a default value on a pod spec that it didn't expect to see before, and now it ends up doing the wrong thing. So it's sort of similar to this in the, like, if you deserialize it, you are taking responsibility for the entirety of the object. And I don't think that's what most controllers, including admission controllers, really intend to do. And maybe as a project, we should be encouraging people to lean into, especially server-side apply. Send us the diff that you intend to be affected, and leave everything else unset. Don't even try to pretend you know what it means.
So we have 5 minutes left. I guess the state we're in, as Tim said, if somebody doesn't own this and drive it to some sort of conclusion, then we're choosing to stay broken. So I would ask if there's anybody here today that wants to volunteer for that mission, and if not, we probably need to keep trying to hunt for somebody to do it, or we're making that implicit choice.
I think that's you.
That's gonna make it happen real slow with everything else I've got going on right now.
But I think that's the problem for like this
Everybody.
entire call, right?
Right. John, can we track it somewhere?
Yeah.
Add an issue, send this doc in an email, so
Yeah,
more
I
people
can do
than
that.
who are here can.
Maybe
at
we
least-
should turn the doc into a GitHub issue, pin it as frozen immediately, tag every SIG, but primarily, I think primarily this falls in API machinery.
Okay, I think we're done then. CC had a question in chat. I think with respect to validation, it's not just validation. It's that at least in the case that I'm talking about, in the sidecar case, a type isn't really the right construct. A type is equivalent to a one of. A one of is cleaner than the kind of validation that service does, but effectively, semantically, they're the same thing, and it's the wrong construct for this type of thing. So hopefully that satisfies.
Thank you for the information.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We will see y'all in 2 weeks on Code Freeze Day, unless more likely we cancel it because everybody's busy with reviews. But see y'all then. Bye-bye.
Bye.